There is now a digital coup economy. There are folks who are being paid good money to pump out disinformation into elections. It's not just your, you know, Russian intelligence agent anymore. It's the troll farm that exists in Southeast Asia. It's your everyday influencer anywhere around the globe who can be paid, several dollars an hour to pump out the disinformation requested by a foreign regime. And so this is now taking place everywhere. It's all over the world. It absolutely is having a destabilizing impact, not only on longer term democracies, but also budding and nascent democracies. The greatest threat to democracy in 2024 was disinformation. And that 95% of the elections that took place globally were impacted by disinformation.
We have young kids who are engaging in conversations with these AI chatbots and falling in love with them or becoming best friends with them is because they don't know where the line is between real and fake.
Every single technology that I could think about moves us deeper into our isolated selves and out of our communities.
We're going back to the moon, we're pushing towards Mars, we're sending people for science, for exploration, and the impact that these environments can have on our sexual health are so understudied.
Every major innovation has forced us to redefine what it means to be human. The more advanced technology becomes, the more valuable human capacity becomes.
Frankenstein, Ex Machina, HAL 2001. These are classic stories in the collective psyche of our species, and now we are living through this story. It's not to say we've already built Frankenstein. It's to say that no one knows if it is. That is the truth.
Welcome to a new season of Purposeful Empathy, a show dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season, we're exploring empathy in the era of AI.
Together with my expert guests, we dive into the impact of artificial intelligence on democracy, human sexuality, our attention, consciousness, and so much more.
You don't want to miss a single episode, so hit that subscribe button now. And if you like what you hear, post a comment and share the show.
Hi, and welcome. There is so much noise about AI right now that it's hard to make sense of it all. The warnings, the predictions, and the promises. I've spent the past 15 years studying empathy, and what I want to understand is how will AI impact how we treat one another. So I decided to speak with a variety of experts, and the result is this 25-part series exploring how artificial intelligence will reshape our relationships and society. Turns out there's a ton at stake. So I do hope you'll join me on this learning journey. Today my guest is Dr. Darin Johnson, a law professor at Howard University, a former attorney with the Pentagon, U.S. State Department, and White House, and the author of Digital Coup, The Conspiracy to Thwart Global Democracy. In this conversation, we explore how social media and AI are undermining democratic institutions around the world by spreading misinformation, why democracy is increasingly vulnerable to technology designed to monetize outrage, polarization, and distrust, the implications of living at a time when a handful of US tech giants are fighting for global dominance in the AI space. So, if you want to better understand what's at stake and what you can do to help protect democracy in the age of AI, this show is for you.
So, welcome to the show, Darin. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Anita. I'm really excited to speak with you.
I'm excited to speak with you. I want to congratulate you on your book. We published our books respectively with the same publisher, Broadleaf, and I had a beautiful experience. Did you?
Yes, it's been a fantastic experience. They're really a wonderful publishing company to work with, and as you know, they really support their authors. And
yeah, so big shout out to Broadleaf and all of
absolutely.
those. Excellent. Okay. So look, you went to Yale on a military scholarship and graduated from Harvard Law, and you worked at the Pentagon and served as White House counsel under President Obama. You've advised on international law for the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad during the Iraq War, and you've also worked on peace processes, transitional justice, and human rights across the Middle East and Africa. So today you're a professor of law at Howard University and the author of the book, Digital Coup, The Conspiracy to Thwart Global Democracy. So I'm extremely excited to have this conversation. I think there's so much to unpack. But first, I'd love for the listeners and the viewers to meet you, besides the impressive bio. So I'm just wondering, what would you like anybody to know about you?
Oh, well, thank you for leading with that question. I think I just like the viewers to know that I am my parents' son. I was raised by a teacher. My mom is a lifelong educator, science teacher, high school, and then she was in her later life she was a high school counselor. And my dad began his career. Actually, he right out of college he was sent off to Vietnam, right, and he decided that men of his generation knew, right, that they were going to end up in Vietnam, and so he decided that he'd go in as an Army officer. So he, did ROTC, went and served, came back, and had a nice career, in sales and marketing. And what I would say about my parents is, taking from both of them, a commitment to service. My dad being a military officer, I think in many ways that influenced the path that I ended up on early in my career. And then now that I'm an academic, that directly ties into my mom's career as an educator. So I'm very much, a child of my parents and their experiences and their values.
Oh, well, that provides a little extra context for who you are and what you care about. So thank you for that. And say hi to your mom. I love teachers. Teachers, I love teachers. I have a soft spot for
I
teachers.
absolutely love.
So you now teach, speaking of teaching, at Howard University. This is an institution with a celebrated legacy of producing lawyers who fight for justice and human dignity. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your current research and work as a law professor and what your scholarship is about these days.
Absolutely. So my research, today I focus on the balance between national security law and policy and human rights law and policy, both within the United States and globally. And so that, encompasses so many things that, I've done professionally before my current academic career, as well as my, ongoing research interest and passion. You mentioned, Howard University and our mission really to be an institution that trains lawyers and graduates to serve the social good. And so that very much flows through the scholarly agenda of those of us on the faculty. And so, as we'll get into when I talk about Digital Coup, very much exploring current social issues, impacts on human rights and national security, really flows through my work.
Okay, so prior to becoming a law professor, you worked as an attorney at the Pentagon and the State Department, White House. I wonder if maybe you could shed some light on how those experiences helped shape your perspectives about current work that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I really, like to communicate to audiences, particularly in the United States, but also globally, is that, I had the privilege of, kind of working inside in these institutions that where people made decisions that impacted everyone's daily lives, whether national security decisions, foreign policy decisions, or you name it. And one of the things that I took from my years in public service is that those decision makers, right, the day-to-day civil servants, military service members, and foreign service officers, they are our neighbors, they're our family. They're just everyday people trying to do their best, oftentimes under difficult circumstances. I think one of the things that really shaped my perspective on, law and policy was having served at the Pentagon. I was there about a year before 9/11 happened. And so that was very early in my tenure as a lawyer, as a young professional. And so the decisions that flowed, how those decisions were made, seeing the back and forth between career folks and political folks, and how decisions were made, some of which I agreed with, many of which I didn't, really informed my perspective on the value of having people with integrity in those really key positions, and also realizing that I'm not sure if the narrative translates outside the United States, but oftentimes we particularly right now, there's a lot of derision that has been placed on career civil servants, military members, and just wanting to make clear to the public that those narratives are really, ideological and not rooted in reality, right? The folks that serve and have historically served in these positions are very dedicated individuals trying to do the best under difficult circumstances, and maligning them and trying to characterize them as something other than good, decent public servants, does not serve anyone other than some folks' political agendas.
Well, as a citizen of Canada, tomorrow's Canada Day. In a few days, it'll be Independence Day. Is that what it's called? Yeah, 4th of July,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, 4th of July, state. Yeah.
So we're both celebrating our nation, and 250 is a big milestone for the U.S. Congratulations. I feel though that people north of the border are in a lot of pain watching what's going on to your beautiful country. And when I hear you talk about, the people who occupied these professional career jobs, who are not only dedicated, but like well educated and well learned over the, sphere of influence that they were working on. And I could just have this picture of like the chainsaw, the Doge thing, and then USAID being, the soft power that was lost as a result, and the fractured relationships with international friends, that longstanding friends. I mean, it's remarkable. And in such an important moment in time, I think the gravitas of what's happening in the United States cannot be understated, not only for your own country, but for the world.
Absolutely. And, I know it's painful for our friends and neighbors in Canada and our friends around the world. And it's equally, if not more painful, right, to those of us in the United States, and particularly those of us who really care about our institutions, who care about the rule of law, who've had the opportunity to serve with many of the folks who are, have been mischaracterized by this administration, and those who've wanted to take an axe to it for their own, again, ideological agendas. It's been quite painful to see and to watch. I try to remain an optimist. And my hope is that after we get past this moment, we will have the opportunity to rebuild, to show, who America really is, right? America, in my view, America is its people, right? Not an administration of a particular moment, but it's people writ large. And my belief is that, our people writ large don't support what we're seeing. And so I don't think what's happening now represents the vast majority of Americans. And I think it's important for those of us who have an opportunity to speak up and say that.
Right. So this provides the perfect backdrop and segue to talking about your book. Okay. So you've recently published Digital Coup, The Conspiracy to Thwart Global Democracy. I mean, Digital Coup, it's making a bold statement. And I know that the book is focusing on how digital platforms, primarily social media, can be exploited to undermine democracy through disinformation and other practices. And you also discuss how AI exponentially increases those harms. Darin, I don't want to sound alarmist, but it feels like we're at this critical moment that we just talked about. So why did you write this book, and what do you want readers to walk away with?
Absolutely. So this, well, let me start with a story, right?
Okay.
That kind of leads into how I wrote this book. So in the spring of 2018, I was preparing to go on a radio program, and I was asked to speak about Department of Justice Special Counsel Robert Mueller's first set of indictments. So folks are very familiar with the Mueller report, which was released in 2019, but about a year earlier, maybe a month or two into Mueller's appointment, he released his first set of indictments. And so I remember reading these indictments, preparing to go on the radio program. The indictments had literally just been released. And as I read through them, literally my jaw dropped. I was utterly shocked because what Robert Mueller had done in his indictments, and his indictments involved several Russian agencies and Russian individuals outside the United States, and described in detail how these intelligence agencies and individuals had engaged in a meticulous, detailed digital campaign to divide Americans. And so it detailed how they literally studied American society. They studied our, our racial history, our social divisions, political, ideological, demographic, and they studied them so that they could use the new platform of social media to stir up social division and to not only undermine Americans' faith in one another and to polarize us, but also to undermine our faith and belief in our democratic system. And so once I actually read what was happening, it literally, it was just a moment of shock for me. And at that moment, I decided, okay, I'm going to explore this topic. I'm going to understand it better. I'm going to write about it in my scholarship. And so that led to several law review articles exploring the topic. And ultimately, about a decade after that 2016 election cycle, the book Digital Coup. Because what I wanted to do was to say, okay, now that we're 10 years past that first moment where I and much of the world became aware of this new anti-democratic tactic through social media, where do things stand in terms of the use of those tactics? And that's what the book Digital Coup seeks to do, is to say, what we first became aware of in 2016 is actually now commonplace. It's been mainstreamed into as a geopolitical tactic to undermine democracy. And so Digital Coup seeks to make that argument and to raise awareness.
It must have felt like a spy movie when you read that Mueller report, and now it must read like, oh my gosh, we are living that reality. And I wonder, how have you made peace with that reality over time? Worried a little bit about how much more erosion could unfold. How are you doing? How are you doing personally, Darin? How's it going?
Personally, I'm okay. It's interesting. So that reality, of course, was disturbing, but unfortunately, we've been through so many other disturbing things since that time in the U.S. that I think it's, and globally, I think it's really required all of us to dig into our resiliency, right, and to look for, well, what can we do in this moment to, if not to either address the problem, and if it's not something that we can solve ourselves, what can we do for ourselves to healthily make it through the moment? Unfortunately for me, the two kind of segue in terms of writing and research and putting law review articles in the book out there. In many ways, my writing and research helps me to identify problems and to translate it to the world. And in some ways, I view that as, a way in which I, as a scholar, can help to address the problem by bringing light to it. And in another way, it is kind of cathartic for me, right? So actually being able to write about something, provide my view on it, and assessment helps me to kind of move through these moments of, these unfortunate moments, right? These anti-democratic moments in which we see, things that everyday citizens care about. And then particularly for someone who, spent a career dedicated to the rule of law and human rights, things that I very much care about and am passionate about, to see those things eroded. And so the opportunity to write has helped me, I think, shine a light on the problem, and also has been cathartic.
Right. So I really feel why you were motivated to write the book. And I'm curious, if you were on a subway somewhere and you saw someone reading the book, what would you hope they're picking up as the key messages, but also like once they close the book, then what? What do you hope for those readers?
Yeah, I hope that it helps people to put the pieces together and to say, okay, actually, these tactics that are being used not only by foreign authoritarians, but also domestic political actors, hate groups, and others have now become commonplace. I actually argue in the book that we're well into the era of the digital coup, and I don't think that's changing anytime soon. So helping people, kind of see how it started, understand that it's now commonplace, and then to take a step back and say, okay, well, how am I going to operate within, my respective political system in light of this information, and what can I advocate for? What can I do personally on a daily basis to ensure that I'm not, not. I think in many ways we're all going to be victims of these tactics because it's very hard, oftentimes to know who is actually communicating or posting online. But even if you can't prevent yourself from becoming a quote unquote victim, right, or a target, you can be a wise consumer of digital technology.
Right. That discernment is so important.
Yeah. Yep.
So I know that you're not an investigative journalist, but you're the book is leaning into, doing a little deep dive. So at the Pentagon and the State Department and the White House, you've seen how power operates from the inside. And I have a question for you. When you look at how governments are currently regulating or failing to regulate social media and AI, what do you see that the public doesn't see?
Yeah, so one of the things that, I tease out in the book, and I think that, particularly in the United States is a conversation that we're going to have, is that, our adversaries, those trying to undermine democracy, have really taken our strengths and turned them into vulnerabilities in this particular space, right? So one of the things that I think, the United States, many of us are proud of, right, are that we have, a stable, functioning democracy, that it's a pluralistic, multiracial, multi-demographic democracy, that we have an open society, that we have the freedom of expression, freedom of speech. All those things are strengths. And I think what the folks who architected these tactics were very, I don't know if wise is the right word, but I think we're very insightful in understanding, was that in an open society, right, that prides itself on all of these things and that would seek to protect them, that those same tactics could be exploited. Namely, right, this idea of freedom of speech, right? In the United States, the First Amendment, our freedom of speech, in many ways is viewed as sacrosanct, right? People believe that they should have the right to say what they want, with exceptions, right, in spaces that they choose to express themselves, and that there should not be limitations on that. What is, I think, unique about this argument of protecting the First Amendment, freedom of speech in a digital space, is that with the advent of social media and digital platforms, and now with the entry of generative AI into this conversation, the point I always make to folks is that, okay, let's take the point, right, that constitutionalists and the Supreme Court has argued for years is the reason for freedom of speech, right? The most central protected category of speech is political speech, right? And we want to protect the freedom of speech so that folks are able to fully express themselves, and that folks don't turn to other alternatives if their speech is limited. So let's take the point that yes, freedom of speech for human beings and for our citizenry is very important. But I always ask the question, freedom of speech for who? Right? So if we want to protect freedom of speech for members of a polity, of a community, and we agree that that's important, we also have to realize that many of the entities who kind of exploit that notion of protecting your freedom of speech are individuals falsely presenting themselves as Americans. And now with generative AI, we have AI communicating and presenting itself as a human being. So if the conversation ends at no, we can't have any form of regulation, we shouldn't be pursuing content moderation because that will limit freedom of speech, then we haven't had that second conversation, which is freedom of speech for who, right? Is our focus on protecting freedom of speech for, folks falsely presenting themselves as Americans, or generative AI falsely presenting itself as human? I think most people would say absolutely not, right? And so that's, I think, the entryway point to, well, what are some of the other things that we can do to protect the freedom of speech for actual human beings communicating with one another? Because really, in the absence of that conversation, the political town square, which has now become digital, has been invaded and undermined.
Right. So this opens up a whole new line of question around what the American citizen that cares but feels that they have, like, this is like a massive bit of infrastructure that's happening. It's happening at a geopolitical level that's way beyond their realm of influence. Okay, so let me back this up by saying that some believed for a long time that social media and even AI potentially could have strengthened democracy, right? Better informed citizenry, more accessible government, broader participation in the democratic process. But the version that we're living, as you're describing, is like you've got tech companies that are monetizing political anxieties, and there's extremists that are weaponizing misinformation, whether it's happening domestically or infiltrating from across borders. I just wonder what you think under the circumstances and the context, what everyday citizens can do to help course correct.
Yeah, it's
Now.
yeah, right now, like yesterday.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you laid out the question as you did, right? Because I think there is a vision for social media and technology that does not have to lead, right, to many of the negative impacts that I talk about in the book. But it requires a conscious endeavor, right? And so, in the book, I talk about how kind of in the early 2010s, before before we get into the 2016 election cycle, you actually had things described such as the Twitter revolution, right? And the fact that you had some early kind of pro-democratic movements, both in Iran, the so-called, Persian Spring or the Green Movement, and then the later Arab Spring movements. Many of those advocates for greater human rights, greater democracy, many of those political dissidents, they used social media, Twitter, and other existing technologies to organize, right, as an organizational tool for protest. So there is, and I remember the conversation at the time was about the way in which social media was a game changer for political dissidents and authoritarian regimes, and for the youth protest movements. And so it was, much of the focus was on, the potentially game-changing positive impacts of social media for greater democratization and human rights. And at least from what I read, there were many authoritarian regimes that were very nervous about that, right? Very nervous about how this new tool could be used by their citizens to undermine their authoritarian grip on control. And I think it was at that moment, right, that many authoritarian leaders, including Russia, decided that, okay, we're now going to find a way to exploit social media for our own gain, whether that's, using it to spy on, citizens and particularly political dissidents, or, as we saw, and as I explore in Digital Coup, as a vector for undermining democracy and social cohesion in democratic states. And so I think that, that focused effort by authoritarians and bad actors, in the mid 2010s, folks saw how relatively successful Russia was, and then it just kind of took off and exploded. And now there are, not just bad actors, there are entire economies Um, but I do want to come back. You can see I'm passionate about this topic, so I could go many different directions. But I do want to come back to your question, which is, what can be done to rejuvenate it, right? To go back to the kind of the early years, the expectations that social media and technology would be used as a tool of democratization and human rights. And I think the first step is understanding the way in which these technologies are intentionally being used by bad actors, and having a proactive, conscious democratic agenda that is being pushed by, by pro-democracy, pro-human rights citizens. And I think that's a conversation that hopefully this book will lead to.
So do you envision the ideal reader as a 20-something? Like, are they your students? Yeah.
I wrote the book really for everyone. I wanted to translate these what can oftentimes feel like it, as you said, these very high level, complicated geopolitical issues, involving technology, into concepts that were easily digestible, by everyone, right? So yes, my students will be a reader, but I want it to be folks who aren't law students, who aren't policy students. I want it to be, I want it to be something that the general public can access and understand, and then translate into their own understanding. That was the goal.
Okay, so you just alluded to democracy building efforts in countries, right, that you were advising on in some places, right? Conflict in Libya and Yemen, Sudan, post-Arab Spring transitions. So when you look at social media and what social media and AI are doing to democratic institutions in the States, I wonder if you could pinpoint like specific concerns that you have and also what you see as particularly I don't know if I'd call it low-hanging fruit, but like what are the opportunities that we can actually seize?
Yeah. So, well, one of the things that I tease out in the book is that the early attack that I talked about, the 2016 U.S. presidential election, that the tactics are now quite commonplace. So in 2024 was called the year of was dubbed the global election supercycle, because 2024 was the first year in, let's call it recorded history, where you had the largest number of people on the planet who are participating in some form of election.
Right.
Right.
And there were, I remember hearing that. Yeah, it was like
Yeah,
hundreds of
yeah,
millions of people, a billion people. Yeah.
So I think 2024 is a good place to look. And my book, in many ways focuses on 2024 to understand what elections and democracy look like during that global election supercycle. And one of the statistics that I talk about in the book that is that the World Economic Forum concluded that the greatest threat to democracy in 2024 was disinformation, and that 95% of the elections that took place globally were impacted by disinformation in some form. Right. And so I discussed that statistic, and I discussed the fact in the book to make it tangible, right? To say this isn't just a theoretical argument. This is actually what is happening in every election, right? And it makes sense from both, kind of an authoritarian perspective, a government externally seeking to influence democratic elections for their own gain. But if you think about it domestically, it also makes sense for individual political actors who see these tactics and techniques as something that can benefit them personally. And so it's almost this perfect storm where these techniques are now have now been mainstreamed and can be used by the highest bidder, right? And something else that we didn't talk about yet is that there is now a digital coup economy, right? There are,
Way to put it.
there are folks who are being paid good money to pump out disinformation into elections. It's not just your, you know, Russian intelligence agent anymore. It's the troll farm that exists in Southeast Asia. It's your everyday influencer anywhere around the globe who can be paid, several dollars an hour to pump out the disinformation requested by a foreign regime. And so this is now taking place everywhere. It's all over the world. And to the point of your question, it absolutely is having a destabilizing impact, not only on longer term democracies, but also budding and nascent democracies. And so I do think that this is one of the biggest challenges to strengthening democracy around the world, as well as maintaining democracy, right? In states like ours, where we've been privileged to have, stable democracy for quite some time, this is quite a destabilizing force.
So who is it? There's a very famous American politician that the end of the quote goes, "For as long as we can keep it," or something like that. I feel like, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I apologize that I cannot remember the individual who made the statement, but I believe it came out of the drafting of our Constitution.
Yeah. So who was that?
Yeah, so that was a famous quote that actually came out, one of the founding fathers, right? It came out of our Constitutional Convention, and if I recall correctly, it was Ben Franklin, right? And he was asked, well, what did you create? What did those in the Constitutional Convention create? And I believe he said it's a republic if we can keep it.
I got goosebumps, and I'm not even American.
Yeah, it's this acknowledgement that democracy is not just a noun, it's a verb. Right. It requires active engagement. And as we can see, right, and as my book makes clear, you certainly will have folks who are actively attempting to undermine democracy, right? And so it requires a similar active effort by those of us who cherish democracy and human rights to protect, to take action to protect it.
And Darin, can I just say, for people who are listening to this as a podcast, am I right to see on screen that you're also touched like I am? Just talking about that? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not making that up. I'm not projecting. Okay. That was you getting
No, you're not.
Okay. So look, you've spoken and written about how U.S. civil rights leaders have shaped the United Nations and the global human rights framework. And I think that's a stunning example of how America has exported its best democratic ideals. But it looks now like there's a handful of US tech giants. I would probably go so far as to say a handful of tech bros are now fighting for global dominance in the AI space. And I wonder what you see is at stake with that paradigm playing out.
Yeah, it's reminiscent of kind of some of the themes that we've been talking about, right? It's not the fact that you have new technologies, right? But it's about who is creating those technologies, what are their objectives in creating the technology, and are there conscious efforts to ensure that the technologies are being used for the common good? Because in the effort of that conscious conversation and those conscious intentions, there will be those, right, that will exploit new technologies in ways that are anti-democratic, in ways that do undermine human rights, if they see a reason to do so, right? Whether that reason is financial or whether that reason is the consolidation of political power and economic power for the few. And so, I think many of the strands of our conversation today speak to the importance of conscious engagement, having conscious conversations about new technologies like AI, things like your podcast, right? Seeking to, inform the public about all of the different ways in which, generative AI impacts our lives and what we should be doing and thinking about so that we can guide the path, right, of how generative AI is used in our lives so that it can become a productive and not a destructive force.
So 6 days out from your 250th birthday, USA, I'm talking, does democracy survive? Are you hopeful? Anything keeping you up at night right now?
Well, Unfortunately, there are a lot of things keeping me and a lot of Americans up at night, and a lot of our friends around the world. So there are a lot of challenges right now. But despite those challenges, right? Well, one I'll talk about. Whenever I am asked about the celebration of the 250th of the United States of our founding, one of the refrains that we often hear described about the United States is that we're, kind of the world's oldest democracy, right, at 250 years. And what I often like to remind folks of is that we really are a young democracy, right? Because if you define democracy as a government that represents and allows access to voting for all of its voting age citizens, it really wasn't until the 1965 Voting Rights Act that the United States did that. And so when you look at the United States from that perspective, from being a democracy that whose governmental leaders are reflected by a vote of all of its voting age republic citizens, we are quite a young democracy. And so one of the things that currently is keeping me up at night, aside from the digital coup issues and the disinformation that I've talked about, are the ways in which, unfortunately, right now, our current government, including our Supreme Court, is really eroding and undermining the Voting Rights Act. And proposals that have been put forward in Congress that would limit the rights of individuals to vote, including women, things like the so-called SAVE Act. It just seems like there are individuals in our society that are so invested in their own political power that they believe that the only way to retain that power is to deny franchise and access to the vote to others. And so that is an issue that absolutely keeps me up at night. But I remain an eternal optimistic, right? I believe that we're up for the challenge. And I believe that we're having very open, very honest, very hard conversations right now about these issues, about the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. And I believe that the American public, because of these, in my view, anti-democratic actions, will be galvanized, right, to renew our commitment to democracy. And so that is what I'm looking forward to.
Well, we're hoping those midterms do a bit of course correction. By the time this comes out, it'll only be a couple of months away. So,
yeah, hopefully the midterms will contribute to course correction, and then we're going to have to look at some more structural reforms. I really believe that.
Yeah, with all
so
the
that what we've seen
gerrymandering.
these past couple of years, quite frankly, doesn't happen again.
Right. Here. So this is a podcast about empathy, and the reason why I wanted to do the interview with you is I'm really having conversations with people across a wide spectrum of expertise that can speak to the influence of AI on the future, to have me reflect on what the short, medium, and long-term consequences are for how we relate to one another and how we keep our bonds glued, like that our social fabric gets stronger, not frayed, right? I care about how we care about each other. So I know this is not what your book is about, but I wonder if you have any thoughts. Where does empathy feed into all of the work that you care about?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Empathy is central to all the work I care about. I don't believe that you can be an advocate for democracy and an advocate for human rights if you don't believe, right, or don't have empathy that your fellow citizens, that the fellow members of your society are entitled to have the franchise, or entitled to have political access, are entitled to be treated humanely and fairly. So I believe that empathy is at the very root of the creation of functioning democracies and systems that protect rights. And quite, in fact, it's the absence of empathy that leads to many of the democratic violations and human rights violations that, quite frankly, we're seeing in our country right now. Right? You can only have some of the policies that we're seeing that are anti human rights if you lack empathy for the migrant, if you lack empathy for someone who may look different than you and their right to vote, if you lack empathy for someone who loves differently, if you lack empathy for someone of a different gender, right? It's only in the absence of having empathy for the rights of the other that you find many of the horrific policies that we're seeing right now. So empathy is absolutely central.
So Jeremy Rifkin in The Empathic Civilization writes, the ability to recognize oneself in the other and the other in oneself is a deeply democratizing experience. Empathy is the soul of democracy. It is an acknowledgement that each life is unique, unalienable, and deserving of equal consideration in the public square. The evolution of empathy and the evolution of democracy have gone hand in hand throughout history. The more empathic the culture, the more democratic its values and governing institutions. The less empathic the culture, the more totalitarian its values and governing institutions. While apparent, it's strange how little attention has been paid to the inextricable relationship between empathic extension and democratic expansion in the study of history and evolution of governance. I thought you'd like that.
No, that is perfect. That is, yeah.
Okay, so as a final thought, and listen, Darin, is there anything that we didn't cover that you want to uplift or say?
No, I think we've touched on everything that I was interested in addressing.
Excellent. So the way I like to close out the podcast, and whether we're talking about democracy, AI, digital coup, or anything under the sun, for as many years as I've been doing this podcast, I like to ask my guest if they can think of a moment in their own personal life or professional when they were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you.
Absolutely. So the moment that I reflected on that, was quite impactful to me was about almost a decade ago now. I unfortunately lost my father, who I was quite close to. And, for anyone that's lost someone close to them, it's pretty typical for people to share their condolences. But what I found most impactful were the conversations that I had with people who had themselves lost a parent at that time. There were several friends, even some professional colleagues who I was not yet close to, but this brought us closer, who actually, called me on the phone, came by my office, sat down, and actually had a conversation with me about the impact of the loss of their parent on them or their loved one, and what they did to get through it, and then ultimately what that path looked like. People were able to tell me, yes, it's quite difficult right now. You experienced the loss, but here's what's going to happen over time. And I appreciate that. I appreciated that at the time, but I think I appreciated it even more over time because they, in many ways, gave me a roadmap to my own healing that did prove to be true. And one of the things that I find myself doing now, ever since that time, is whenever someone I know that's close to me loses a parent or a loved one, I try to actually take a little more time to have some conversation with them
and maybe pay it forward.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry for the loss of your dad. Want to say a few words about your dad?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, my dad, he was this amazing man, right? I mentioned before, he was an Army officer during Vietnam. He was actually, at that time, he was less than 1% of the officer corps in the Army at that time were African American. And so he was one of those officers. He was kind of at the vanguard at that time, by necessity, right? He knew he was going into Vietnam, and he decided he wanted to go in as an officer. But that ability to kind of be at the vanguard was very much part of who he was, right? He came back, and he and my mom started their life in California, had us, and he kind of rose in the ranks at his different corporations and was a very senior marketing officer. He was amongst that group in the late 60s, early 70s that were kind of one of a few African Americans in that C-suite boardroom space, but he excelled in it. And I think through those experiences, he passed on, a tradition of excellence to myself and my brothers. He was always supportive. He, along with my mom, was always the first person I wanted to share my achievements or life experiences with. So his loss cut quite deep. But as people told me, you'll reach a point where the joyful memories will surpass the pain of the loss, and I definitely have reached that point. And so it's thank you for the question. It's always a great opportunity to get to talk about my dad.
Well, I'm so glad I got to know him through your words. He sounds like a very special person, and I'm curious, is the book dedicated to him?
Yes, the book actually is dedicated to both my parents and to my children.
Love that. Okay. Wonderful. So listen, I love asking that final question because I never know the story I'm going to hear, but it's always a moment to remind myself, and hopefully anybody listening, watching, that empathy is available to all of us all the time, and it makes such a big difference in people's lives. So why not do it a little more often? That's the invitation.
Absolutely. And thank you for centering that message in your work. It's so powerful and important.
Darin, good luck with the book. Thank you for making the time. Have a wonderful 4th of July weekend. Happy USA 250. Upwards and onwards.
Yes, thank you so much. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you all for watching and listening. We'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this conversation or found it illuminating, I hope you'll check out other episodes from this series devoted to empathy in the age of AI. And if you know someone who would enjoy the show, I hope you'll pass it along. Before you go, please hit that subscribe button, and I see you next week.